There's slavery, but the real question is how it comports itself towards the national story. Is Virginia a place that birthed the nation or that is part of a birth of a nation?
Well, and what about the issue of tourism being linked to the Confederacy? This idea that Americans would want to not just revisit historic sites of the Civil War, but would specifically want to come to Virginia to sort of commemorate and learn more about the Confederacy itself. To me, it's interesting and it's important that Republican governors keep endorsing that idea and Democratic governors keep not endorsing that idea in Virginia. Are there either partisan or left and right differences of opinion and perception about having a romantic view of the Confederacy?
Oh, absolutely. This particular romantic, and I want to say even imagined notion of the Confederacy, and I say it's imagined because part of what the Confederate story is this idea that somehow poor white Southerners really benefited from the relationship of slavery, when in fact we know that, the vast majority of white laborers did not benefit from slavery. They found that their labor was degraded by slavery. But instead, what happens with this sort of romantic notion of the Great South is that it gets sold as a commodity, so that I can see, for example, rebel flags, Confederate flags in rural Pennsylvania and in Southern California and in downstate Illinois. Now, these are not places that were part of the Confederacy, but they are consumed by Americans across the country who want to have a sort of vision of white supremacy, a vision of this kind of romantic moment in American history where black people knew their place and women knew their place and laborers knew their place. And so this is clearly, to me, about attaching to what he perceives as a national anxiety about the ways in which women and people of color and immigrants are changing and rewriting the American story, and saying, you know what, Virginia will be a nice, safe place for those of you who want to romanticize a past where this sort of, power struggle did not exist. But of course, it's not true. It's simply a romantic notion of the Confederacy. It's not the reality of the ways in which the Confederacy degraded whites and blacks together.
Sure, it certainly puts a very romantic asterisk on it to just forget that slavery was even part of the reason that the South was fighting. He's excused this as this sort of mistake and omission after initially defending it today. But I sort of think that this defines Bob McDonnell from here on out until he gives us a reason to believe anything else important about him.
Yeah, I would agree. And again, having gone to school in Virginia, it's not an uncommon thing to pretend that the war between the states or the war of northern aggression was somehow not a war about slavery. It's a common narrative that emerges in textbooks and in schools. It again, I think, also highlights sort of what happened in Texas recently around the changing of the curriculum. It is critically important that as we tell our history as Americans, that we not only get our facts straight, but also, employ kind of critical reasoning skills to think on our past, because that past is with us even right now.
Melissa Harris-Lacewell, Princeton professor, MSNBC contributor, and one of the smartest people I ever talked to about anything, anytime, anywhere. Thank you so much, Melissa. It's great to see you.
Thank you.
Here's what one worker at the Massey Energy coal mine in West Virginia said after an explosion at that mine killed 25 people and left 4 more missing this week. The person said, "No one will say this who works at that mine, but everyone knows it has been dangerous for years." Jeff Goodell, who's the author of Big Coal, joins us next for the latest on what's going on with the rescue effort in West Virginia. And later on, Senator Tom Coburn of Oklahoma gets really uncomfortably personal with me. Coming up. We have some breaking news tonight from Afghanistan. For the third time, the Taliban has released video that Taliban spokespeople say is of a U.S. soldier who was captured in Afghanistan last June. You'll recall this soldier's name. He's Army Private Bo Bergdahl. He's originally from Idaho. He was last seen leaving his base in eastern Afghanistan. The Taliban has consistently claimed they've had him in their custody. Well, today, a group calling itself the Mujahideen of the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan released this video you're seeing here. They claim that it shows Private Bergdahl with a beard doing push-ups, presumably to show that he is still fit and healthy. 2 weeks after Private Bergdahl disappeared, the Taliban released their first video of him. That showed him with a shaved head, sitting on a rug with food in front of him. He said in that tape that he was scared he wouldn't be able to go home. Then in December, the Taliban released a second video, also reportedly showing him. This one showed him in full army uniform. Now, in the third video that was released today, Private Bergdahl begs to go home. He asks for the return of all U.S. troops and for an end to the war. You see that footage there. Also, Private Bergdahl looking quite different now with a full grown-out beard. We don't have further details to release to you. And, of course, we're going on what the Taliban says this is and what it appears to be. It's not yet confirmed. We will be right back. If you want to dig coal out of the ground, you're going to have to deal with methane gas. It's almost a fact of nature. It's frequently true. Methane occurs naturally in the ground around coal seams. And the problem, of course, is that if there's a certain amount of methane gas in the air, between, say, 5 and 15%, it's very, very explosive. So if you're mining coal, it's really, really, really important that you take measures to get methane gas away from what you're doing, to keep the levels of methane gas inside the mine at very, very low levels. Because otherwise, naturally, methane builds up, explosions can happen very easily, and people can very easily be killed. In Montclair, West Virginia this week, 25 miners died. Another 4 are still unaccounted for after an explosion at the Upper Big Branch mine. The cause of that explosion is still being investigated, but the prime suspect is a buildup of methane gas. Rescuers were ordered out of the mine early yesterday morning, even though there are still 4 people missing, because, they said, of dangerously high methane levels. They have begun now drilling holes into the mine to vent out the gas, but state and federal officials said this afternoon that gas levels, including carbon monoxide and hydrogen, as well as methane gas, were still too high to let rescuers back into the mine to resume the search for those 4 miners who are still missing. Just minutes ago, officials gave another update on the rescue effort, saying there's still a possibility that rescuers could get back into the mine as early as tonight. It hasn't yet happened. The hope is that these 4 miners who are missing were able to make their way to a rescue chamber in the aftermath of this explosion on Monday. A top federal mine safety official who was on scene in West Virginia said today that hope is minuscule. West Virginia Governor Joe Manchin is promising a full investigation into the explosion. Staffers from the House Education and Labor Committee have been dispatched to West Virginia as part of a congressional investigation. And the Department of Labor has just announced its own investigation. Already, though, the Upper Big Branch mine, where the explosion took place, and Massey Energy, the company that owns it, are under intense scrutiny for their safety record or lack thereof. We learned yesterday that the mine had been cited for 53 safety violations last month alone. We know now that the mine was even cited twice on the day of the explosion. Perhaps the most instructive thing we are learning about all these safety violations at the Upper Big Branch mine is not how many safety violations they were, but what they were about. Among the mine's violations was one in January for ventilation systems that are supposed to prevent the buildup of methane gas and coal dust that can cause explosions. According to the Associated Press, earlier this year, federal inspectors found that the airflow had been reversed on a fresh air system that was meant to bring clean air to miners in an emergency. The AP reports the mine foreman told investigators he'd known about the problem for weeks without addressing it. One former federal mine safety official told Bloomberg today, quote, Massey has a history of violating safety regulations, especially with the sins of ventilation, methane, and coal dust that can cause this kind of tragedy. Also, 2 miners speaking on the condition of anonymity told the New York Times today that in the past 2 months, miners had been evacuated 3 times from the Upper Big Branch mine because of dangerously high methane levels. A 22-year-old electrician who worked in the mine as a subcontractor went on the record to the Times saying, quote, no one will say this who works at that mine, but everyone knows it has been dangerous for years. Specifically, according to that subcontractor, workers had regularly been told to work 12-hour shifts when 8 hours is the industry standard. He also said that live wires had been left exposed and that an accumulation of coal dust and methane was routinely ignored. We've also just had a piece cross the wire from Reuters. Jimmy Platt, 54 years old, a former miner who worked for Massey during his 17-year career, said that the explosion at Upper Big Branch mine on Monday was an accident waiting to happen. He said he and other miners were sometimes required to put in 18 to 20-hour days. He says they were told to work what he says was unminable coal, which opened wide cracks in the mine's ceiling, making a roof collapse more likely. Mr. Platt said the main difference between working for non-unionized Massey and working for other mining companies that have union representation was, in his words, the right to say no. Again, methane gas happens in coal mines. There are multiple causes of explosions and other things that can be dangerous in coal mining. Methane gas is one of those things that's just there. It's highly explosive. And it's therefore the very important job of coal mining companies to keep it from building up and exploding and killing their workers. For safety violation upon safety violation upon safety violation, federal inspectors have proposed more than $1 million in fines this year alone for this one mine where this blast happened on Monday. So far, the company that profits from the mine, Massey Energy, has paid only 16% of those fines. As of now, the price paid by the people who actually do the mining is 25 lives. And 4 more for which we wait and hope. Joining us now is Jeff Goodell. He's a Rolling Stone